Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So last time we were talking about conclusions, right? And we said that the conclusions, whether wajib al-wujud, adam al-wujud, right? The obligation for that thing to exist, or the inconceivable that the thing could exist, or jaiz al-wujud, maybe, maybe not. All three of those fall under two types, right? Dorori, which means that it's self-evident, or nadari, that it needs evidence, it needs dalil. Now, what do you think the majority of the scholars of Ahl Sunnah said God falls under, right? Is it wajib? Is it, an obligation intellectually to affirm that? Is it a inconceivable reality? Or is it possible? So the majority of our scholars said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence is wajib aqli. Wajib aqli. But what kind of wajib do you think it is? Self-evident or needing dalil? If you say that it's self-evident, then I would respond and say, then why did Allah send books and prophets? Why would he call them proofs? What are they proving? They're proving his existence. So for that reason, the majority of our scholars were brave enough to admit that God's existence is not self-evident. And again, this runs counter to the idea of Islamophobes, secularists, people who have serious issues with God, right? And the idea that Islam is anti-intellectual. Because our scholars believe that the obligation to affirm God intellectually rests on proofs and responses, what are called barahin and hujaj. So that right there goes back to the notion of why the aql, why the intellect, the use of the intellect is the first obligation. But just look how amazing our scholars were, man. That they would take people from wajib, right? From wajib aqli, we're going to talk about how those who needed it, they would take them from that first, and then they would arrive here at wajib shar'i. And this is how they married respect for the intellect with respect for the sacred. So what did I just say one more time is, by starting out with the idea that belief in God is an intellectual obligation that is based on acquiring knowledge and affirming that knowledge and ultimately digesting that knowledge, that leads to then accepting the fact that it's an obligation religiously. So that's how they responded to the that's how they responded to the Hellenistic and pagan incursions into the Muslim world, and kept it balanced. And you just really have to be blown away about what they did. So in order to do that, instead of teaching theology, how many of you have studied it, where, you learn all the differences of the sects, and then, you learn about, was this position correct or wrong? Or was this imam right or wrong? The majority of Ahl Sunnah, for over 1,000 years, simply taught people qualities. They did not go into the specific details of theology. And there were reasons for doing that. Number one is they wanted to help people avoid differences over theology. If we look at the Western Muslim community and how theology has been taught, we have to ask ourselves, the Sahaba were divided, they learned belief, and they became brothers and sisters. We were brothers and sisters, we took a course here and there, and we left enemies. Well, what's the outcome of then learning Aqidah, when Aqidah, its job is to unite us with God, right, in the sense of affirming his tawheed, and then uniting us with one another as a community, and then using that to calibrate us to be in the service of humanity, right? So the first was to help people avoid the theological differences that scholars were busy with, because they knew that people may turn these differences into means of harming each other and fighting the ummah. Imam As-Subki said that all of my students succeeded except those who started their studies by learning the differences of the early scholars. One time Imam Ibn Taymiyyah received a letter from some people who said to him, we are actually physically fighting over what is the meaning of God rising on his throne. And he wrote back and didn't say anything about the rising of the throne thing. He said, why are you guys fighting each other? Right? So to protect the ummah from differences that would lead to them fighting each other. So now we have to ask ourselves, people who are teaching theology in a way that causes us to turn against each other as a religious community, we have to be suspect of that methodology, because the outcome of theology should be that we love each other more, we have more mercy towards each other, and then we are more committed to healing a fractured world and a world which is broken. The second thing is, the reason they taught qualities about God is to create a relationship with God that preserve two things. And I want you to remember these words. You need to remember them. Transcendence, which in Arabic would be ulu, right? That Allah is not like anything and there's nothing like Allah. And the trick of that is preserving that while also preserving His nearness, His qurbah. So, that's a daunting task, right? To affirm something being unique, being omnipotent, laysa kamithlihi shay, but at the same time having a clear, close, meaningful relationship with that object. So scholars set out to do that. Allah says, وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ. That's ulu, right? There's nothing like Allah. But then Allah says, فَإِنِّي قَرِيب. I'm close to you. Right? So affirming transcendence with closeness without sacrificing either or is a challenge, right? Some religions give God so much transcendence that there's no personal relationship with Him. Others, in order to make Him so personal, have turned Him into like a statue or an idol, right? Without affirming His transcendence. And that's where we see the beauty of Islamic theology, mashallah. And the third and final thing is to teach a theology that prepares people for public life, right? The goal of theology is to prepare us to have a very powerful personal relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As the Prophet said, أَفَلَا أَكُونَ عَبْدًا شُكُورًا. Should I not be thankful to Allah, praying in the night? But at the same time, it prepares us for public life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, kuntum, right? خَيْرًا kuntum خَيْرُ أُمَّةٍ, right? كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس, right? Sent to the people. أخرجكم الله تعالى للناس, right? So the idea of أخرجت, right? للناس, you are sent for the benefit of the people. And that lam, linas, is called lam fa'ida. So you're sent for the benefit of people. That's the outcome of aqidah. So again, our scholars recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is known, right? It's an obligation to affirm it intellectually, but based on what? Proofs and responses. Quran, Sunnah, the world around us, and so on and so forth. That's logic as well as the sacred. So they married them both in an age where both of those are so divided. What an incredible opportunity to learn this theology and heal a fractured world. And then we talked about why they taught these qualities that we're going to talk about, instead of getting into the finite, the subtle issues of theology. For those three reasons, we'll talk more about this inshallah in the future. Barakallahu feekum wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad. And perhaps some of our brothers and sisters that are out there teaching will understand the responsibility of keeping the community together, right? Not dividing the community. Jazakumullahu khairan wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.